I'd like to welcome you all to the CSS seminar series spring semester. Today we have the great pleasure of hosting Aliakbar Akbaritabar, who is an assistant professor of computational social science at the University of Rostock and a research scientist at the Max Planck Institute for Demographic Research in Germany. He's a computational social scientist with a background in sociology, and his research focuses on scholarly migration, mobility, social and collaboration networks, and computational social science, as I've just said. Before joining the Max Planck Institute, he worked at the German Center for Higher Education Research and Science Studies and the German Competence Network for Bibliometrics in Berlin. He holds 2 PhDs, one in economic sociology and labor studies from the University of Milan, and another in sociology from Alamat Tabatabai University in Tehran. And I'm so sorry for butchering a lot of names along the way. His research work examines global patterns of scholarly migration and collaboration using large-scale bibliometric and digital trace data, combining, of course, computational methods with sociological questions. With that, I give the floor to Aliakbar. The floor is yours, Hocam.
Thanks a lot. Thank you for the kind invitation. Let me thank you for inviting me to this seminar series. And Zafar knows that I have really nice friends in Istanbul, so I always look forward to having any kind of connections. But unfortunately I couldn't visit. So let me start sharing my slides. Hopefully you should now see the slides. And
yes, we can.
Okay, nice. So this should
Hello,
be in full screen, hopefully.
hello, Hocam. Thank you very much. I'm sorry, I had some difficulty joining our own meetings link, but I'm finally I'm here. Thank you very much for being here.
Thanks a lot. So what happens here is I will skip this and I will try to tell you that I'm going to give an overview of some research on mobility, migration, and collaboration of scholars. And the outline looks like this. So I will give a brief introduction of the goals here. Then I will talk about how can we repurpose bibliometric data for computational social science research. And I will give you 3 specific examples. One would be mobility and migration. There, the question we are answering is who has higher chances to move between scholars. Then we look at collaboration networks, and the question, of course, is who collaborates with whom. And afterwards, the combination of the two. Do scholars who are mobile move where they have collaborators? So that would be the goal of the third question. The type of data we are using here, bibliometric data, as an example of digital trace data, has some issues. One of the documented issues is called left censoring. I will describe that and provide one example solution that we have prepared using machine learning and how does that work. And of course, I would conclude by saying this is not yet anywhere close to finished and what could be the future research. So I will do not expect you to remember this outline. So I would put it on the top left side so you can understand where we are at each time point. So as a brief introduction, here I'm going to talk about 2 areas of research. One is mobility and migration. The idea could be pretty simple. When we look at scholars, they have to publish as part of their day-to-day business. And when they publish, they write their institutional affiliations as the addresses where they did their research. Looking at these institutional affiliations, when a scholar changes these affiliations, for example, their institution where they did their job and published the work changes, and later years we see a new affiliation happening, we can make an assumption saying that perhaps they change their residences too. This is an assumption similar to any other assumption. It can be prone to some issues and errors, but it allows us to construct trajectories of migration. Using that, I can now here give you an example. What do we mean by bibliometric data? Here I'm showing you one publication of myself where my affiliation was in Italy. So by the time that is in 2018, that when this publication came out, my affiliation was in Italy, but a few years later, I have another publication that came out in Germany. So just by these three metadata, one, the name, then the year, and the affiliation address, we can assume that at one point between 2018 and 2022 that the next paper came out, for instance, I have moved from Italy to Germany. Of course, again, this is an assumption and we can discuss during the Q&A, but it allows us to construct this type of trajectories. Here I'm giving you an example, so a fictitious example of a scholar. Let's call her Maria. And she starts her publications in 1998 with a Canadian address or affiliation. We consider that as her affiliation as the country of academic birth. When we look at her affiliations later and following that, if we construct such trajectories, we can see that somewhere between 2001 and 2002, her affiliation changes from Canada to USA. So we can take this and consider this as a signal that maybe she has moved. What we do here is that in each year, some scholars can have multiple publications. So we reduce those using the mode affiliation address. There are different methods to do this. What we have done during different years and different publications is to do on tests using this. And we realized that using mode allows us to reduce noise and consider these changes that span at least 2 years. So it is more linear term moves versus like, let's say, short term moves that here we are not looking at those because our focus is on migration. If we do that at the country level, we can construct trajectories like this. And I'm showing you here in the black with the black dots what comes out of bibliometric data. And on the arrows, I'm showing you what I have extracted from an actual scholar's CV. So here we can see that, for instance, they start by their PhD, where they were a PhD student. Then they do some years continued in the same institute in Amsterdam, then they moved to Utrecht, and afterwards they come back to Groningen. So looking at these black dots from bibliometric data, we can see that it could have noise as well, that this person has never been in the US and that's an affiliation of their collaborator, but using the mode of these affiliation addresses in a year allows us to reduce such noises. So that's at country level, and we can see that this scholar has always been in Netherlands. But when we construct that at subnational level, we can see that this person has moved multiple times between subnational regions in the Netherlands. So that's how we create such trajectories. And we create this and publicly share it so you can access this data at the country level. This year, since January, most of my time have been spent with my collaborator Tom Tyler and Emilio Zagini on updating this database to 2026 version. So we are still working on that to hopefully share that in June. But for now, you can already access this publicly, and that includes data like this. For instance, here I am showing you on the what is called net migration rate, which if you look at the formula here, it allows us to calculate this for both internal and international moves by looking at the number of people who are arriving to a region, so that would be I, minus those who are exiting a region, and if we divide that by the population of that region, we can then multiply that by 1,000 to present that as a measure of 1,000 of scholars. And we can do that for both internal and international. So here I'm showing you two maps, which are both at the country level. On the top, I'm showing a map based on Scopus, and on the bottom, I'm showing you the map based on OpenAlex data, which has a higher coverage. But for most countries, the colors are quite similar In green, they are receiving more scholars than they send, and in red, they are sending more scholars that they receive. So we can do some things like this at the country level. And for example, a country like Italy has a negative NMR, net migration rate. That means they send more scholars elsewhere than they receive. We can look at this from origin and destination country perspective too, so to construct flows. And this allows us to see, for example, that Italy has sent most scholars to places like UK. In the y-axis is the source country, and then on the x-axis is the destination. So it has sent most scholars to the UK, France, and Germany and Spain. These are the type of analysis we can do, and of course you can take this data and add more to it. This is available via scholarly migration database that we have been working on with colleagues since years now on it. And the first version came out in 2023. We are hoping to update this in 2026. And you can find on the website, you can find dashboards that allows you to check specific countries or subnational regions, both of them. And you can find the publications and the replication data or the data of this, the one that I just showed you. We have done research on using this data ourselves as well. For example, in this paper, we were focused on the gender differences between scholars. If men are more mobile than women, for example, that was our question here. And we noticed that the gender gap in scholarly migration has reduced, but it has not disappeared. On the figure on the left-hand side, I am showing you 4 panels, and each of these dots show one country. So the study here was at the country level, and we were focused on some countries and looking at shown in the x-axis and the gender difference or gender ratio among all scholars. That is, how many women do we have among the scholars per one man? And then on the y-axis, we show the same measure, but for mobile scholars or migrant researchers. You can see that some countries, like for example, Japan here or South Korea, they remain on the bottom left quadrant in all 4 periods when we come to their most recent ones. And then, for instance, they are not improving that much. Some countries like United States and like, let's say, Germany and those, they are already at a parity, and they maintain this position. And some countries, they go through a transformation. So they move towards top right side of this figure. So we can consider that these countries become more gender equal as the time progresses. On the figure on the right-hand side, I'm showing you the most attractive regions of destination for men and women. But here, in the interest of the time, I will move on so that I can show you more results. So here we looked at this another dimension and the connection between this migration of scholars with economic development. Can we find countries where they have higher development and then they go through a different trajectory in migration of scholars or not? On the figure on the left-hand side, I'm showing you on the x-axis the GDP per capita in US dollars. That is a typical measure for development and how wealthy a country is. And on the y-axis, the immigration of scholars. So how many scholars per thousand are leaving that country? We can see that when we move from the left-hand side towards the right-hand side, the immigration in those two big, like solid lines that are the fitted model to this data, we can see that immigration decreases when the development increases. But at some point in about $25,000, it starts to increase. So the immigration increases. Part of this could be scholars who are trained there in these countries who are leaving, and I will come back to that in the last session, the last part of this talk when I'm talking about left censoring issues. Of course, those studies I showed you were at the country level. So the next move and the natural move we could do was to bring this to subnational level and look at the regions inside countries. Here is what we have done in GeoNames admin 1 level. which in different countries this can mean different things. For example, in the US, that is equivalent to the states that they have. In, like, let's say, like Australia, that is equivalent to 6 different regions. So here again, we have net migration rates that I have put the formula on the top right hand side. So we do the same thing for subnational regions. Do they receive more scholars than they send in comparison and standardized by the population of that region or not? And what we have done here on this map is to merge both internal and international moves. So this is a balance measure. So if a subnational region is depicted in yellowish colors or red colors, it means they send more scholars. I can draw your attention to India, for example, here, because the figure here is from 2000 to 2005, and we can see that many regions in India have yellowish and red colors. That means they send more scholars than they receive, both to internal destinations and to international destinations. And now I switch the map and I would go to 2006 to 2011, and you can see that some regions remained red in India, but some regions now are depicted in green colors. So that means they are receiving more scholars than they sent. If I switch the map to 2012 to 2017, you can see that the trends continue in some countries, like the case of India, that they are now still, some regions are in yellow, but they are light, they have lighter colors. So most of the scholars have already left. That could be one thing that we can draw one conclusion. And you can see that picture coming across. For example, if you take the case of the US, not all the regions are uniformly receiving more scholars. Some regions, they receive more, some they send more scholars. Now, moving closer to us, focusing on Europe, here we can see that, for instance, it depends on the country's conditions. And for instance, in Germany, southern regions, some of them, they are receiving more scholars, like Bavaria region, it's depicted in green here, while, for example, some other regions, they send more scholars than they receive. And when I put the more recent years in the same, like in the similar map, you can see that some regions continue to send more scholars than they receive. Like, I can give you the example of Italy, that southern regions in Italy continue to send more scholars than they receive. Now, considering that you guys would be more interested, of course, to see the conditions of the Turkey, so I cut this map to focus on Turkey. I could not zoom more. I'm sorry for that, because the quality was coming down. But here you can see in the first time period, many regions in Turkey are depicted in gray. That means we do not have enough data for those regions. But for the ones that we have, some of them are depicted in yellowish colors, red colors, some in green. And here I need to remind us that this is a balance measure between both internal and international moves. So scholars could be coming to those regions that are depicted in green from other regions inside the country or from international origins. In the supplementary materials of this paper that you can find it on the reference on the bottom left, we include these two maps as separated between internal and international, so that allows investigating those in more detail. Now, I would now move to the more recent time periods, and you can see here that we have more regions covered in Turkey. We have only one region here depicted in gray, and most other regions are now, they are either green or yellow, or, for example, other colors. So we have more data for them. And now if I include the latest period, you can see that some regions continuously in all three maps continue to stay red. That means they send more scholars than they receive. And some of them, they have greenish colors, for example. So that was what I had prepared for the migration. And now I want to switch gears and go towards collaboration network. And here the question is, who collaborates with whom? So we can take the same approach and look at the affiliation addresses of scholars, but this time we can construct collaboration ties between them and see who collaborates with whom. So this is another scalable idea, like it is a simple but a scalable idea. And here I'm showing you one example. How does it look like? So I'm showing you two papers, one on the left-hand side that has these authors, and we can construct this edge list from them, like the first author collaborates with the second, third, and the fourth one. And then we can do the same for the second author and the third author and fourth. We can do the same for other papers as well. And because they share some authors, then when we construct a network using this edge list, some of them will be overlapping nodes. That could look like what you would have on the left-hand side. We have some nodes like these ones that are paper nodes, and then some of them that are authors who wrote those papers. This is what is called in network analysis a two-mode network, and we can of course project it to one mode on the right-hand side that allows us to see who collaborates with whom. So all the nodes there are of type authors. If we do that, as I did here for the all scholars who are sociologists in Italy, we get a map that looks like this. So you can see that many subgroups or what is called communities are emerging that are collaborating just with themselves. And here in red are Italian scholars, and in gray are scholars from anywhere else in the world. So this is why we call that Italian sociology is a community of disconnected groups. And the giant component, the largest connected component is this part in below. And if I zoom in on that part, even that one has its own subgroups that are collaborating more with each other. And there were some subgroups that had only one tie between them. So if we identify the subgroups in these communities that are collaborating more with each other, we can then ask what is the factor bringing them together? And that's what we did here. So those circles that are around each community, we wanted to know what brings them to collaborate with each other. And we looked at the composition of each of those communities based on gender. Are women more, for example, in some communities versus another? Are the composition of the country of affiliation different? Or in Italy, they have assignments to each scholar gets an assignment to different disciplines. Are specific communities composed of, like, let's say, sociologists of, let's say, media and communication versus others? That's what we did here. And in addition, we looked at the type of concepts or the terms they were using in their papers. So the yellow part of this map shows the focus of community 0 that includes 65% foreigners, and they have mostly worked on media, science, communication, and these topics. Now, we can do that for all of these communities and find their focuses. I will move on to say that we can do that, and we can put that in combination with different bibliometric variables such as migration, mobility, number of papers that they write, to identify scholars who are more productive, more mobile, highly cited. And our focus here was, are these group of scholars who are highly successful, highly mobile, and they collaborate more, the same group? Can we identify a subgroup of scholars who are doing well in all of these factors? That's what we did in this paper. And depicted in red colors, dark red colors, are the scholars who are doing well in all of these variables. And in yellowish colors are those who are not doing well, for example, in the number of papers, in mobility and such. And you can see in different disciplines, each subplot shows one discipline. And in all of them, this darkest red color is the subset with somewhere between 15% to 10% to 15% of scholars fall into that group. So they are the minority, but they are highly successful, and the majority fall into other categories. We looked at that in terms of collaboration networks between them as well, and we see that these scholars that were in darkest red, they are collaborating with all sorts of other scholars in other classes. So now I will move on to say that we can take these two variables, migration and collaboration, and put them in contact with each other and ask questions. Do scholars move where they have collaborators before? Here I can say that the answer that the literature gives is a paradoxical. So we can construct something like this. On the top, I'm showing you co-authorship network of, like, let's say, a hypothetical scholar. And on the bottom, I'm showing you their mobility trajectory that you saw before at the country level and in subnational level. If we construct this, we can then see, for example, for some groups of scholars, here our focus was on non-mobile scholars. So we had a sample with 2,000 scholars who were non-mobile, 3,000 who were mobile but inside the country, so they were not mobile internationally, 3,000 scholars who were mobile both in international sense, and then about 3,000 to 2,900 who were mobile in both of them. Further than that, we took a subgroup of them. So we took these based on those bibliometric variables I described. If they are, like, let's say, highly successful, they are publishing more versus a control group that are slightly, like, they are very close to them, but slightly below. And what we identified here was that those scholars who are more mobile, falling into potential talents group, they seem to have a higher number of collaborators and they have a different tendency when it comes to mobility. And when we look at their mobility trajectory, where they are going, they have a tendency to increase their mobility towards like their collaboration, sorry. They increase their collaboration with an institution where it will be the destination of their next move. So they collaborate with an institution, then they move there, and after the move has happened, you can see that this is quite dropping, and that means they are not collaborating that much with that institution anymore. So this is what we find that is still under review, but that shows that scholars strategically collaborate with institutions where they are going to move. And the opposite was not the case, like, for example, that they move there and then they collaborate, for instance. We did this study in a more elaborated way that is now that is forthcoming to appear hopefully in a few weeks or months time. Here we looked at different types of ties. If they have collaborators in another institute, or direct collaborators like co-authors, or if they themselves do not have a collaborator but their institution has a tie with them. For example, imagine like a supervisor having ties with others there in an institution, and then we wanted to see if, like, let's say, PhD students graduating with those supervisors would end up going there, or if they have both type of these ties, like individual and institutional, or neither of them, like they have no ties and they move them. We looked at other variables, like we control for gender, we controlled for, right, let's say, disciplines, and many other variables, but specifically we looked at the scholar's size of the network, the type of the mobility, and how strong is the connection to the destination, like based on the number of papers they have with them. And interestingly, here we noticed that, for instance, for international moves, one seems to like the subset of scholars we were looking at, this about 200,000 scholars, they seem to use more their individual ties, that is depicted here in individual in green color, versus for national moves it was using either both ties or institutional ties. That was another thing that we noticed. And if scholars had a larger um network of collaboration, they had a higher tendency to use they had a higher tendency to use their both type of connections or individual connections, which was another interesting thing we saw here. So now what I will do is I will talk about these problems that we can have with this type of data, and I'm hoping to show you some solutions. So you remember this picture that I showed you at the start of a fictitious scholar called Maria. So we do not know when she starts her career, her publication career, because our data license starts from 1996. We drop 2 years, so we take from 1998 to give 2 years of chance for them in case we have not observed any, like let's say, activity. And then we start looking at their trajectory of moves after 98, but we do not know if this person started their career in, like, let's say, 1990 or 1994. That is something we cannot tell because of the data issues that is called right censoring issues, left censoring issues, sorry. Here, if I tell you that Maria's full name is Maria Casnici, then one thing that comes to mind is that that looks like a typical Italian name, for example. So if we use machine learning and we assign a nationality to this person based on their name, we can say that at some point, maybe before they moved from Italy to Canada, then they start their publication activity there. But again, here, we cannot draw this assumption yet until we observe a move. So what we do here in this paper that came out in ICWSM last year, we looked at the moves that this person does. For example, if at one point she moves from USA to Italy, then we look at the country of their name and the country of their birth, academic birth. And then to identify if this person is going where their name appears to be from that country. If we construct something like that, we can see that 97% of scholars who have Chinese names and they are affiliated to China, so their country of birth is China, they have Chinese names. So most of them are Chinese scholars based on this type of analysis. When we look at Germany, we can see that 73% of scholars there have German names, but 3% have English names and 3% have Chinese names, for example. If we do the same for India, we see that 90% of scholars there have Indian names. If we look at countries that are considered as countries of immigration, they receive more scholars. Here, for instance, for the case of Australia, Canada, and United States, we can see that the composition there is much more diverse. So, for instance, in Australia, there are 13% of scholars who have Chinese names. In Canada, that is 14%, as in United States, that is 14% as well. Here again, we are just assigning a nationality to their names, but we cannot yet say if this scholar is moving, like let's say, to their country of origin. That is what we do on this step. So we look at the moves that they have already done, and then on the left-hand side, we identify if this moves is to a country where that is different from their country of birth, academic birth. So the persons, like let's say, and here is the case of USA. So their country of academic birth is USA, and in year 98 to 2002, they are moving to Japan, or they are moving to United Kingdom and Canada. On the right-hand side, we see that, for example, this person's country of academic birth was Japan. They came to the US and then now they are moving back to Japan. So this is how to rate this figure. Now, if I add the country that we assign based on machine learning, here the picture changes. We can see that the scholars whose country of name origin is the United States or English names, most of them, they go to Canada or, like, let's say, United Kingdom. But when we look at those who start their career in United States again, and they have Japanese names, we can see that after we have observed the move that are happening, many of them, they are going, those who are going from United States to Japan have Japanese names. So we can consider that that is not an immigration from the US to Japan. That is a return migration of a Japanese scholar going back to their country of origin. And here you can see that the highest share in the recent years is to China, for example, or South Korea. Versus when we look at academic origin, we would have considered that as, for example, the composition would be very different. Now, I will give you that in all, based on all continents and divided by gender. Here again, we can see that up around 25% of scholars who who have an academic origin in Oceania, they are emigrating. In the US, that is about 35%. They are going somewhere else. But when we look at the country of academic origin on the top versus the country of the name, we can see that return migration increases from about 35% to around 50%. So we have a 15% increase in the rate of return of these scholars that in the previous slide I showed you, most of them, they are like, let's say, Chinese scholars going back. So now I will try to conclude in the next 5 minutes to say what could be the next steps. Here I showed you examples on how to repurpose the bibliometric data to study mobility, migration, and collaboration of scholars. I showed you some trends in subnational and international migration of scholars. And then how can this differ based on the gender of scholars or based on the country's level of development? Further, we looked at the effect that collaboration networks can have or the role that it can play in scholars' migration and the decision where they are going to go. And then we discussed the left censoring issues that can be present in such data, digital trace data, and how can we address them. These are the type of research that I would consider as the two sides of computational social science. The deductive side, that is more what we know in social sciences, in sociology, that they start with a question and theory and they try to gather data and address it, and the inductive part of the computational social science, which starts from the data and it tries to learn its features and then tries to answer questions and find regularities and similarities between them. So here I hope I have given you some examples of both of these types of deductive and inductive type of research. And what can be happen next is that there are a lot still that has not been done. One is the macro policies that, for example, different countries put in place to motivate the migration and collaboration. Some countries, I can give you the example of, like Italy, for example, they have research evaluation exercises that they value migration or they value collaboration. They try or they value productivity. So if you are more productive and you have international collaborations, you have a better chances to get grants. This next question we can ask is, are these policies affecting the scholars' behaviors or not? Then in the meso level, we have communities of scholars, like let's say in institutions, that they see each other's behavior. For instance, since 5 years here, I'm working in, like let's say MPIDR, which is an institute where there are a lot of mobility happening. Many scholars come and then they stay for some years, then they find jobs elsewhere and they move. Does this have an effect on the mobility behavior of other scholars there? So that is the type of research we can still do by looking at meso level and communities. And then when these scholars move to certain countries, do they collaborate with the scholars who are from that country or not? That is something we can call as integration in the host country. There are some bottom-up emergent behavior that can come out of these individual behaviors and community practices, that some of them I tried to show you with this observational data, but we can still look at them in combination with the meso level and micro level. And then more importantly, we need to talk to these scholars and to survey them, for instance, to know if they are following those policy signals or not, if they are interpreting the policies in a different way, and whether there are some, because we know mobility is a privilege, whether there are some scholars who actually wish to be mobile but they cannot, due to caring responsibilities, due to parenting, due to, like, let's say, care for elderly, that they cannot move. So we can term them as either voluntarily mobile or involuntarily mobile or immobile. And of course, we can look at the immobile majority of scholars that I did not show a lot about them here, but in some research, we have already looked into those that are the majority of scholars and they do not move. And exactly, some build collaboration ties to try to go around, like if they cannot move, but they try to have collaboration, international collaboration, so that they have access to this privilege in terms of collaboration at least. This is the type of model that I have put beside each other, and I'm hoping to go towards this direction and study them in the next steps to look at immobile scholars, those who do not move, but they host others or they form internationalized collaboration, and to look at those top-down policies and how do the scholars interpret them in the micro level. So I will stop here, and I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts and uh, and uh, and comments. And I would like to thank my collaborators, of course, and my mentors for helping me get this work done.
Thank you so much for this truly inspirational work. We do have a lot of questions in the chat box. So what I'm going to do is some of them were sent to me as direct messages. I'll read them out loud, but also paste them so you also get to see as I read them. So we will start with Alberto question, which I'm pasting here now. He's asking, for both migration and collaboration parts, had you considered analyzing the age of the scholars at the time of migration or publication as you did with gender? I think it would be informative to see how the career trajectories of researchers change over their careers. We have quite a number of questions. Should I collect some of them and then you respond and then okay.
Please.
The next one is coming from Barke Elibol asking, thank you for the great presentation. My question is on potential practical applications of bibliographic data utilizing these networks. Do you think it is possible to create researcher tools that boost the literature review processes, expands collaboration opportunities, or simplifies searching for graduate programs, PhD advisors, etc.? Is there a tool that already uses this data for such purposes? Let me paste this one also because this was, I think, also sent as a direct message. All right, that was the second one. Should I get one more, or would you like to respond to these two first?
As you wish. I'm taking notes of them so that I can remember them.
Yeah, I know. I mean, you can also, I mean, I'm gonna put all of them in the chat box if you'd like to go back, but maybe we can start with the first two and then I will continue with the rest.
First, let me thank you for the thoughtful questions. This is really interesting. For the first one about age and how does it differ in comparison to, like, let's say gender, that is one of my long-term wishes because, as you all know, Robert K. Merton, he had a chapter in his, like, one of his premium, like, let's say one of these prominent books on sociology of knowledge, where he talks about aging in aging and age differences in academia and among scholars. So I have been wishing to do that, and now we have a PhD student who has been working on that since past year and a half, and I can already tell you, yes, there is very much big differences between age, but there we have a problem again, that the age we are looking at is academic age. So when the scholar starts their career, for some subsets, we have biological age, but and I already can tell you that based on academic age, we see differences, and that plays a role when it is put in contact with gender. But then looking at that in terms of biological age is something that we wish to do and we have not yet managed. We are like, one of the things we are discussing is to run a survey or to use some subsets. But I completely agree with you, that plays a role. For the second question regarding practical implications, and like I wrote a recommender system for like, let's say mobility, or like, let's say like let's say short-term visits or similar. This is something we have received as a comment a few times, I must say, and I will not be surprised if that happens because someone like some of the um like let's say those who study scientific mobility might actually try to to give this as advice. But my background is in sociology, so I can already say that every single scholar's trajectory could be different, and it is embedded in their life, like let's say experiences and the background that they have. So it would be very difficult to try to give like prescriptions or advice on how they can go about their scientific career to be successful. But I would not be surprised if that happens. So it is pretty difficult. Like there are literature trying to predict if scholars will have publications that would be highly cited or when in the career someone will win a Nobel Prize. And we already know the results of those papers that show it is pretty much impossible to predict those. So yeah, I that would be my answer.
Thank you very much. There is a question from Albert Ali Salah. Thanking you very much. In many cases, people move out before having their first publication. Turkish and Iranian students come to the EU after high school or after their bachelor's. Their publications will not reflect their mobility as they have not published in their home country. How to debias the data?
Thanks a lot for this question. This is another thoughtful one, and I appreciate this. Because many of these scholars, they are graduate students. They come and they do their PhD there, they do their postdoc, and that is when they start their publication career, their first publication. Like if you look at my own career, my first publication in English was in Italy. So I would be considered an Italian scholar, while my publications in like, let's say in my country of origin, like in Iran, they are not in English. So they would not be even indexed by Scopus. That is a big problem. And we have so far, we are try to go towards addressing it. One of the things we have done and we are trying to address it is by looking at the names of scholars and then trying to look if they are going to a country when they are moving that could be their likely country of their origin or the country of birth. But again, there we cannot be sure because there are some issues with assigning names, assigning nationalities to names. And the second thing we are trying to do yet still is to use larger databases that have a better coverage, like OpenAlex, for example, that used to be called Microsoft Academic Graph. There some problems comes into play, such as author name disambiguation, like when the same scholar is identified in a, like let's say with errors in comparison to like someone else with the same name. Like Scopus does a better job at that, but something like OpenAlex allows us to look at non-English publications to a much better degree. So that is something we are moving towards, like in the database, scholarly migration database. We provide data both on based on Scopus and based on OpenAlex, but we always put a note of caution saying that OpenAlex data is prone to a little bit more error in that sense. So I appreciate your question, and I hope that in about like 2 years' time, I would have a better answer for that debiasing. But yeah, that's a very important point because the training data even that we use for gender assignment or to add what is it called nationality, that training data is highly populated by Western countries and cultures and text. So it has a much better chance to identify a German name versus like let's say a non-English name, non-German name, or like let's say an Arabic name, for example. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to get a batch of 3 questions. So, starting with Rumeysa Türk-based question. Did you also look at which institutes or universities these are scholars affiliated with? I'm asking this question because I was thinking of analyzing the co-authorship network for one of my classes, and my hypothesis was those from high-ranking universities are more likely to collaborate with each other, and then this eventually results in the formation of a periphery-centered dynamic within scholars' networks. The second question is from Yunus Emre Gündoğmuş asking, what do you see as the main limitation of bibliometric data for studying scholar mobility, and what complementary data sources do you think the field needs going forward? The third question is coming from Helin Özdemir, asking, my question comes from a different angle than gender or collaborators. Disability and chronic illnesses are largely visible in bibliometric data, but they materially shape mobility. Visa health screenings, accessibility. Sorry, did I say visible? I was going to say invisible. Visa health screenings, accessibility of host institutions, conference and fieldwork feasibility, assistive infrastructures that don't cross borders. Do you see methodological routes like survey linkage or qualitative supplements that could surface this dimension? It's a population both structurally constrained in mobility and systematically absent from the data the framework relies on. I'll pause here so we can respond to these three first, and then we still have a lot of questions.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. These are really interesting questions. So the first one on institutional prestige, I can say a definite yes. There is a homophily between institutions. This is something that I can say that I showed just one slide on it that is forthcoming, that will come hopefully in a few weeks or months in PNAS Nexus. There we look at institutional prestige, and that is at play in both co-authorship and mobility, like when scholars are moving. And previously, the work by Aaron Closet and Larry Moore has shown that as well, that highly prestigious institutions have a kind of a homophily on who they are hiring between themselves. And here we show that when the institution has a higher prestige, then those they are moving to, like, let's say, institutions following neither type of the tie. Like, they do not need to use institutional ties or individual ties. That is something that we have observed and we assume that could be because of their institutional prestige. The second question regarding limitations of bibliometric data, thank you for raising that. And I think that was followed up by doing like interviews or doing like surveys of scholars. And I can say, yes, please consider doing that, because this is very important. We have had this question of evaluating the bibliometric data's problems or um, biases, and we have used like, let's say, CV data from ORCID as one example. There we observed that in bibliometric data we have less moves than we see in the CVs, because the employment history is in the CVs. Because it is a little bit more difficult to publish than, for example, to edit ORCID profiles. But looking at the actual CVs, like PDFs of scholars, even in small samples, or doing interviews with them, that would be really helpful to know not only about the accuracy of the data and mobility, but also about the motivations behind their mobility or lack of mobility, which is very much in line with the next question that was about disability and chronic diseases, for example, or, if I understood this right, visa issues, for example. This is another important thing as well. Zafar knows that many people from my institute now are in the US for our yearly events that happens in the US, that every year about 40 people from our institute go there, and I did that for 3 years. Then some changes happened in their system that I am in pause for going there, simply because of that, until, like, let's say, some administration changes, lifts travel bans, so that I can go back to those conferences. So I completely understand what you are saying. That is unfortunate. And like, for any kind of like institutional, like let's say any kind of conferences or short-term visits, these screenings happen. And you had a point about health problems that that is invisible, that is not seen. I want to give another example. I completely agree with you. First, I completely agree with you. I want to give another example. When caring comes into discussion, like having care responsibilities, the first thing people think about is having children, like small children and not being able to move. But one thing that is totally invisible is elderly care. Like when someone takes care of their elderly, sometimes there are some stigma associated with it that people do not even mention it in their, like, let's say, professional context, but it inhibits their mobility possibilities. It inhibits their migration prospects. So I completely agree with you, and it connects to the previous question. Collecting interview data or talking to these scholars would allow identifying such cases. I can give you one citation that is, I think her name was Martina Schauer, the German writing Sher. I can write it if you drop me an email, where she did interviews, small scale interviews with scholars in the UK and two other countries, but between academic couples, and seeing who whose career was prioritized when they were deciding to move. So she has written her dissertation about that, which is very interesting, and it has a lot of interesting insights to contribute to this discussion. I will pause there.
Thank you so much. So in total, we have 6 more questions. It's absolutely fine if, by the way, if you need to run to another meeting or something, but if you have a little bit of like maybe 15 more minutes, you
Sure,
may try.
please.
Yeah, I'll read them out loud. So let me do 2 batches, 3 questions. İlayda Küçük Afacan is asking, you're repurposing bibliometric data not designed for mobility research. What is the biggest systematic blind spot this creates compared to survey or administrative data? The next question, which I shall also paste to the chat box so you can also see, is coming from Emre. The Güzel Dal asking, it was clear and really interesting. Thank you very much for your presentation. My question is, you're finding that approximately 50% of US immigration is actually return migration is striking. But the name origin classifier conflates ethnicity of descent with country of origin. A third-generation Chinese American named Wang gets classified as Chinese origin and counts as a return migrant if she moves from the US to China, but she's not returning anywhere. She's just emigrating to her grandparents' country for the first time. In settler colonial destination countries with deep diaspora populations such as the US, Canada, Australia, this misclassification should be largest. Have you validated the classifier against the ground truth subsample where you actually know country of PhD or country of birth? And what does the return migration rate look like if you restrict to first-generation migrants? A rather long question. Should I read the next one, which is not that long? So I'll go ahead read it. It's coming from Şevval Çakıcı. So I was thinking with AI tools, now co-authoring papers, do you think that's gonna completely change how we measure scholarly collaboration in the future? I'll pause here.
Thanks a lot. I took now note of these questions. They are really interesting again. Interesting. So the repurposing of bibliometric data and the blind spots, the first one in this group of questions. There, I would connect that to the question that Albert asked about coverage and biases in coverage. That is one of the largest blind spots that we have. That is very unfortunate. For example, if I'm 100% sure many of the scholars in this room and your collaborators would publish in journals that would be in Turkish language, for example, that would not be perhaps even indexed in databases like Scopus. Those publications are completely falling outside our radar. So that would be something that I can call a blind spot, as you called it, like in terms of coverage. And you mentioned in comparison to survey or administrative data, those could help us identify such problems um, like the example I was showing with comparing CV with the bibliometric data, where this person had never been to the US, but still in bibliometric data we had that as happening. There was the next question was about return migration, and that was really a really nice question because what is it called? I would say a scary one because we looked at second generation migrants. So this person is asking about third generation migrants, which is brilliant. Like when we were looking at this, we were aware that if we look at the country that we assign by machine learning to the name of the person and we look at the migration event, if we do not look at the migration event, we cannot tell if this person is born and raised there or if they are migrants, for example, that they came there as a first generation migrant. The first thing we did was to observe if a move has happened so that we can say that this person is going where the country that the destination is likely the country of their name. But again, there we could not say if it is a second generation migrant going to, like, let's say, the country where their parents came from, or if it is a like third generation migrant. The suggestion you are giving on comparing a subset of it with country of PhD or birth, I would say please do that. That would be amazing. If you would like to do, that would be a really nice contribution to the literature. There was the next question regarding AI tools, and how can that affect how we measure collaboration. I think that would highly affect in terms of like productivity. That would be very like it would affect because um, we already know there is an inequality in access to such tools. So if some institutions have higher like possibilities to have access to these tools, they would have a privilege or premium in using them and being more productive, for example, if a likely future to happen. So that would surely affect the productivity of scholars. And that plays a role because we know that those who are more productive, they are highly more collaborative as well. They collaborate more. So that would play a role there, I would assume. And at the same time, in these type of databases, we have higher number of signals for them because we have more observations for them because they are publishing more. So they would be like similar to the issue that I mentioned regarding training data. When you have more observations of a certain country, then there is the higher chances that those people will be represented or identified. So I can see that will play a role. For mobility, again, they will be observed more, but I need to think more. How can that play a role in the mobility? But collaboration, I think it will affect. It will have an effect on the collaboration, or at least that's my speculation for now.
Thank you so much. The last batch of questions. First one is coming from Mehmet Badınlı. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. I have a question. Like you've shown that mobility is heavily driven by existing collaboration networks. Doesn't this reliance on social capital create a cycle system favoring established core institutions? Also, how might this affect an academic meritocracy on a global scale? The second one is coming from Saliha Nur Gökçe, and let me paste that question also in the chat box if you'd like to take a look. She is asking, oh, I'm so sorry. I think I sent the previous one to her. Anywho, so your subnational maps show a clear spatial inequality. I wonder, do you think this trend is creating a permanent brain drain from the periphery to the center? And can digital cost tools realistically mitigate this divide? And the very last question is coming from Pelin Yüce. Bibliometric data offers a useful starting point, but it is also narrowing the definition of collaboration. It misses collaborations that do not lead to outputs, as well as short-term or teaching-focused mobility. This made me wonder whether some labeled as non-mobile researchers may actually have participated in these forms of mobility. You also mentioned cases where researchers moved to the institution of their collaborators, after which collaboration levels appeared to decline. Were you able to examine what happened to their ties with their previous institution? It would normally be expected them to act as bridges between these two institutions, especially when moving from a peripheral to a more central position. And I promised that was the last question.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for sharing these. These are all really interesting questions. I appreciate them. The first one regarding existing collaborations and social capital, and its consequences for meritocracy in global, like let's say in a global scale. That is similar to the prestige question that we discussed, that that it leads to isomorphism, or it leads to communities that are closed, like that you cannot get into those because you don't have the right ties to them. So I can like similar to what has been termed as invisible colleges in terms of citations, or so I can see that, and I would say that could be that could be at play and role. We have not looked at that here. That would be a really nice thing to study. On the study that we had on stratification, in global stratification in science, there we could see the trends where a minority of scholars who were highly successful, highly productive, they were the mostly highly cited as well. They were the ones who had higher collaborations. So that is something we have seen, and the mobility was the interesting variable that was the most open one, like the variable that had the highest share of, like let's say, medium or bottom class scholars was happening in mobility that was not completely dominated by the top class, which was interesting. So mobility plays a role as an equalizing factor, we can call it. But I do understand your point, and related to the previous question that there are visa restrictions, there are like some problems. There was a second question regarding spatial inequality and permanent brain drain. Yes, I can completely understand that, because like for the case of, I think the example I was discussing was the less developed regions in the south of Italy, for example. They have continuous or permanent out-migration to other regions in north of Italy that are more developed, and to other places in the Europe or the world. So that is happening. In Africa, we observed that as well. But to be honest, I do not know. Like we can see this spatial inequality, but what can we do about it? That would be something we have to figure out in terms of like policy directions as well. So I wrote this down. I need to think, and I do not know what can I say. For collaboration and the definition of collaboration, there I'm completely on board with you, the person raising this question, because co-authorship is only a proxy for collaboration. There are many people who are acknowledged in publications as people who supported or helped, but they do not end up in the list of authors, like let's say in the paper. Or the teaching duties that was mentioned by this person, that is a good one, that someone might go somewhere for teaching, like let's say ties, but they do not end up like publishing something. And there I would use the example that your colleague gave on administrative data or survey data that perhaps can help us, or CV data to address these. But I can completely agree with you that bibliometric data would miss out on such cases that does not cover those. But let me thank you all for these questions. They are really thoughtful questions and I appreciated them a lot.
Thank you so much for taking the time to answer all of these questions. And with that, I'll pause the recording before I forget.